containing information not just on the specialty necromancer wizard class. The Complete Book of Necromancers also includes details on character backgrounds, factions, secret societies, new priesthoods, and even has a mini campaign setting. We're going to talk about one of the more popular second edition Dungeons & Dragons books today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. This is also going to serve to be on my playlist for old school gaming reviews, even though this is, an OG or original product from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. This is the Complete Book of Necromancers. And I wanted to talk about this today for a couple of reasons. First off, it's now September 30th, so we're sort of going to be moving into that fall and, specifically Halloween time period. And I know from my group in particular, the game that I run for my daughter, we always like to kind of have like a Halloween type session. So we actually just had it this past Saturday because we realized that with the girls, that it's all my daughter and her friends. Now that they're in high school, they're all going to like homecomings and none of them go to the same school. So they're all busy on different weekends and the parents are going to be gone. And so we realized that we weren't going to have an October session, unfortunately. So we ran our Halloween session a couple days ago. But for those of you who do want to have a Halloween session and are planning ahead, I thought I would get ahead of this a little bit, give you time to kind of like maybe look for this particular book and see if you wanted to use it for a session, an upcoming session. Now, I will tell you this book is going to be extremely difficult to come by in the secondhand market. And if you do find it like a print copy, it's going to run you a minimum like $100, probably $120. I know people have found it like half price books for a lot cheaper than that, but I don't have one of those near me. So your best bet if you want to acquire this book is you can go on like DM's Guild. It might be on DRIVETHRURPG too, but you can get a PDF copy that's pretty clean, which is what I did. And that's what I have here. So I had an older PDF copy of this that was not good. And so I got a new one that's much cleaner and easier to read. Second reason I wanted to do this look at this book is because the last video that I did, I looked at the 15 books in the PHBR series. So PHBR is Player's Handbook Rules. So in that video, I said I thought that the R stood for like resource, and then someone dropped in the comments and said no, they think that the R stood for reference, which totally made sense to me, and I thought that could have been the case. But then after the fact, I looked it up, and it turns out that the R in these series, so the PHBR series and the DMGR series, the R stands for rules. Now, in that series, because I was only covering the ones in the PHBR, the 15 books, I didn't cover this one, but a few people came into the comments and they're like, you forgot the Complete Book of Necromancers. I didn't forget. I wasn't looking at it because I was only looking at the ones in the Player's Handbook series. And this was part of the Dungeon Master's Guide series. And the reason for that being is because they intended the options in this book to be only for dungeon masters to create adversaries for their player characters. So, this book is written in very much a similar style as the other books in that other series, in the PHBR series. So it's going to have kits. It's going to have, new skills or, new non-weapon proficiencies is what they called them at the time. New equipment, spells, all that kind of stuff is going to be in here. Plus more, there is stuff in here that is definitely geared towards a dungeon master running a game. But I feel like the Player's Handbook rules, had those as well. Like the Complete Book of Thieves had, details on how to build a guild. And while a player could use that, I think a dungeon master would use that a lot to like kind of, expand their world creation. So, that's why I didn't cover it. But because so many people came into the comments and said, like, you forgot the best one, which was this one. And I do like this book quite a bit. And I've used it. I actually used it for the game that I just ran for my daughter. I used some of the ideas from this. I put a necromancer in that game. So I thought, let's look at this now. It's one of the better reviewed books in the second edition line. So, you don't see too many negative comments about this one. Whereas like in the PHBR series, you'll see people say like, oh, this book was pretty good, but this one was bad. you don't see that too much with this book. Most of the reviews are pretty positive. So I figure, like, let's go ahead and look at it. Now, one of the reasons why they wanted to limit this to just dungeon masters instead of giving these options to player characters was because during this period of time, this is late in the TSR era of Dungeons and Dragons. So this book comes out in 1995, and there's going to be 2 more books in the DMGR series after this: the Sages and Specialists, and of Ships and Sail, something like that. Sea and Sail, something, whatever it is. It's about, running a sea-based campaign. Those 2 are going to come out after this, but then the Wizards of the Coast is going to acquire TSR. TSR basically was going to go under and go bankrupt and have to sell off all their assets, and they were, swooped up by Wizards of the Coast. And but during the TSR era time, and especially during the second edition era, there was a big theme at the company that they didn't want to do anything to anger people and draw negative attention to themselves. So it all stems back to a case where there was a missing kid. I'm not going to go into the details, but the short version is there was a kid that ended up missing from his college campus, and a private investigator was hired, and he, not doing his due diligence and making a bunch of assumptions, decided that the reason this kid was missing was because he had somehow lost his mind into the fantasy world of Dungeons and Dragons and had disappeared in the steam tunnels under his school and died. Well, it turns out that was not true at all. The kid had just left town. He had a lot of emotional problems, unfortunately, but he had left and gone to, like, I think it was Louisiana, and I believe at the time he was going to school in Michigan. So he'd made a long trip to get there, and but it was all over the news. And so this sparked, and it was coinciding with the satanic panic of all these people that thought that, D&D was bad, and it was, from the devil and all this kind of stuff. It was a real thing, folks. Like, it just, and it's not difficult to believe, but, people are always blaming outside sources as bad influences when kids do things bad. At first it was like rock and roll, and then there was comic books. Actually, the comic book one, I think, even came first. And before that, it was got to be something else, right? This isn't something that's limited to the 20th and 21st centuries. But music and comic books and, like video games, all this kind of stuff. And Dungeons and Dragons was one of the things that people decided to seize on and say that it was bad for you. So at the time, the management at TSR, and particularly James Ward, who at this point in time, we've talked all about James before. I have a whole video that I did as a tribute to him after he passed away earlier this year. But he had written an article in Dragon Magazine, number 154. So we'll look at that here. This is from February of 1990. So this is during the second edition time period. And he writes this article for the Game Wizards, which was a regular column called Angry Mothers from Heck and What to Do About Them. And the gist of this article is that he says he's trying to avoid what he calls the angry mother syndrome, which is if a topic will anger the normally calm, caring mother of a gamer, we aren't interested in addressing that topic in any of our game products. And he says, he knows that, we have like a company selling adventures full of swordsmen slashing away through armies. But he says, like, you're not fighting for its own sake. You're fighting for a good cause. And then he says the good cause part is largely what role playing is all about, or what he thinks it should be all about. And then he says, that he goes on to take, like, this is why they got rid of demons and devils from the monster manual. So he says that since 1977, when the monster manual was published, he says TSR's gotten 1 or 2 letters of complaint each week. So this is more than now 13 years later. So 1 or 2 letters per week over that period of time. That's going to add up. So, and then he says that's a lot of letters and it's a lot of angry moms. And so they just thought it was just easier to avoid things that they were going to get angered about. And so, and he says that avoiding the angry mother syndrome has become a good basic guideline for all of the designers and editors at TSR. But brings up a whole other series of things that they have to deal with. But they want their art to be either G or PG rated if it were like a movie. So they're not going to deal in blood and gore and things like that. And they're going to keep the violence to a minimum as much as they can. Using your wits is much more rewarding than using muscles, he says. And then he talks about, adventure is kind of the theme that they want to focus on more than like combat and fighting, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, this is this article. It was a pretty famous article, and it did tick off a lot of players. And to James's credit, in a future issue of Dragon Magazine, he is going to actually respond to those comments that he got from people who said, like, they basically think that he's selling out and he's pandering to a group of people that aren't going to play the game anyway. So why worry about it? And he does address that. But that really is the reason why this was, supposed to be focused on dungeon masters, even though in the second edition player's handbook, necromancy is a school that a specialist wizard can specialize in. And they talk about that in this book, but then it goes on to say that it's really more about the additional options that they're giving players or that they're giving necromancers in this book. And it's that those things that they're talking about shouldn't be things that should be accessible by player characters. Now, what's really interesting, and you're going to see that as we go through this book, the author of the book is it's a little tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of like a wink where if you read between the lines, it'll say things like, these are only reserved, I'm paraphrasing here, but it'll say something like these are only reserved for like, NPCs, adversaries. And then like in the next sentence, I'll say, but if a player character wants to use this, here's how you could kind of address it and, adapt that for your game. So they 100% had to know that players were going to want this book to create a necromancer player character and get all these goodies for their characters. I think that it's more about marketing. It's more about the perception, and they can show, well, no, it says it's only for bad guys. Like, these are bad guys. We don't want players playing this, but there was an acknowledgement, I'm sure, that players were going to do that. So we're going to dive into this in just a second. Now, a couple of housekeeping things here. So I am going to be looking at it as a PDF, I mentioned, because I don't own a hard copy. The other thing was, a few people have mentioned that they think that my recording, and I keep trying to make it better. So I used to, when I was doing these screen recordings, I would use the microphone on my laptop, and people said that wasn't working for them and asked me to like try it on my phone. So now I'm recording on my phone, my voice, and then I'm screen recording my screen, obviously. But then a few people said like, oh, you've got to get a better microphone. So I'm trying something new, which is I've plugged my external microphone that I have purchased. It's a Shure brand, Shure. It's supposed to be good rated, and it was something that like I could afford that was going to hopefully increase the quality of the audio. So I have that plugged into my phone. And then I have my phone on a little tripod that I have in front of me so that I don't have to use my hands to hold it, and I'm screen recording. So please let me know in the comments if you think this video is or audio is better than the audio from the past. It's a hassle for a setup, but if it's going to increase the quality of the audio for you guys, I will happily do that in the future. Okay, so let me know, and we'll be back in a second to dive into this book. Okay, now let's go ahead and dive into this book. So we see over here on the left-hand page that this is the Complete Book of Necromancers by Steve Kurtz. Now, Steve wrote a lot of products for TSR during, particularly during the second edition age. So was mainly focused on works for the Al-Qadim setting. So Al-Qadim was subtitled Arabian Adventures, and it was sort of a 2E version of a book that was inspired by the first edition book, Oriental Adventures. I have a whole video on that book here on the channel, and I'll put a link to that up here. But Arabian Adventures, aka Al-Qadim, was, inspired by, the Arabian Peninsula, historical from history of that, but also, just desert settings in general. And so a lot of stuff that came out for that particular setting was actually written by Steve Kurtz. So there was a lot of TSR did a lot of boxed sets during that time period. And so things like City of Bone, City of Delights, Ruined Kingdoms. I'm just hitting some highlights here, so not everything. Okay. Another thing during the second edition era. So we've talked before, about that PHBR series. So the player handbook Rules Supplements series. Those were those brown books. And then you had the DMGR, Dungeon Master's Guide Rules Supplements. Those are the blue books. Well, there was a third series of supplement books. It was called the HR series, the Historical Rules series. And those are the green books. And Steve wrote one of those books. I actually have this one. It's the Crusades campaign source book. So and that fits, right? Because he's talking about that time period in the Crusades when, Western European knights had gone to the Holy Land and in that part of the world. So it fits in with his kind of knowledge of his history of, the stuff that he was writing for Al-Qadim, even though that's fantasy. And the Crusades book tries to be historical. Okay, so, but that's really all that I could kind of find out about Steve. Again, that's not all that he wrote. That's just a highlights of a few big things. But I wasn't really able to find anything else out about Steve Kurtz's career post TSR, whether he stayed at role-playing games or moved on or did something else. And so if you guys know about that, please share it in the comments below. I'd love to know more about his, later on career, if there was one in the role-playing game industry. So then Steve gets into the table of contents here. And I'm not going to get into this right now because in the introduction, he's going to go section by section and talk about what's in each one of these chapters. And that's just a better place to talk about it rather than reading it here. All right, so then we're going to go over here to the rest of our credits, and we see that the editing was done by Matt Forbeck. So as a reminder, I like to talk about these people because a lot of them sort of not a lot, some of them kind of went away from role-playing game industry after the Wizards of the Coast buyout from TSR. Other people stayed with the company and relocated to the Seattle area to stay working with Wizards of the Coast. Some went to other role-playing game companies. Some left the industry, completely. But I just like to try to remember these people and make sure that we're not forgetting the immense amount of talent that went into creating all the products for this game that we love. So anyway, Matt Forbeck editing, just so prolific. There's so many different things that Matt did, but he graduated with a creative writing degree, and then one of the first things he did, as far as role-playing games, was he ended up editing for Gary Gygax, and Gary Gygax's company that he started after he left TSR in 1986. He started a company called New Infinities, and one of their products was called the Epic of Yarth. So Gary was really big on sort of trying to call his game worlds like something that was akin to Earth. And so the world of Greyhawk takes place on a planet called Oerth, Oerth. So when I was a kid, I thought it was pronounced Oerth. And I always like to remind people, I found out later that it's technically supposed to be pronounced Oerth, Bugs Bunny or somebody from Brooklyn or something like that. But anyway, this product that he did was called Epic of Yarth, Yarth. And it was Necropolis, which Gary's going to revisit later on in the D20 era, which is kind of cool. But that was one of the first things that Matt Forbeck worked on. And then he worked at Iron Crown Enterprises for a while. And then I'm hitting highlights because he's just done so much stuff. He started up Pinnacle Entertainment with a friend. And that is the company that created the game Deadlands. So if you're familiar with Deadlands, you have Matt Forbeck to thank for that. And then he worked for Wizards of the Coast, Games Workshop, TSR, White Wolf, just so many more companies. He also worked on video games. He worked on comics, wrote novels. He worked on the Tales from the Loop RPG just a few years ago, and also the Marvel Multiverse RPG. So he's still quite involved. I mean, that Marvel one came out in 2022. So that's, relatively new. And anyway, yeah, so that is Matt Forbeck. Like I said, very prolific. Okay, black and white illustrations by Carl Waller. So Carl worked in TSR art from about 1988 to 1998. And he worked on stuff like Ruins of Undermountain, Al-Qadim, the Draconomicon. I always stumble over that word. And, other things as well. I'm hitting some highlights of some bigger things. But then in addition to TSR, he also worked on stuff like Shadowrun and Earth Dawn and Torg and Vampire the Masquerade. And he has done work in the comic book industry. And that's going to become very evident as soon as you see like the first black and white picture in here that he did. It's going to be obvious that he was a comic book illustrator. Okay, so that is Carl Wallet. Now, these color illustrations, most of these folks we've talked about before. We've definitely talked about Jeff Easley. We've talked about John and Laura Lakey. We haven't talked about Brom. I'm going to save that for a different video because to me, Brom is most associated with Dark Sun. And eventually, I'm assuming I will get to a video on Dark Sun. It's one of the campaign settings that I do own from 2nd edition. And there's a whole story as to why, which is kind of a fun story. So I'm going to save Brom for that. And then the last one here is, so I'm assuming it's Rob, and I'm guessing it's Ruppel or Ruppel. I'm not really sure. So if somebody knows how to pronounce that name, please leave it in the comments. I would appreciate it. But Rob is known for his horror art in specifically in role-playing game industry. And started at TSR in 1992, worked on a lot of stuff, Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and Ravenloft, which is appropriate for this. And I'm assuming, well, I'll get to that in a second, but Planescape later worked for Wizards of the Coast after they acquired TSR, and he did some card art for Magic the Gathering. But he also just, again, one of these people, you can't pigeonhole him and just like, oh, he's the fantasy painter that worked on, role-playing games. Well, he also did art direction on the Disney movies, Meet the Robinsons and Brother Bear, animated films. And he taught at Art Center here in Pasadena, where I live, which is Art Center is one of the top art schools in the whole country. And so anyway, I thought that was kind of a cool tie-in that he worked there. So I was going to say about Ravenloft, I assume that his painting that's in here, where it says color illustrations, was lifted from Ravenloft. So at this era in TSR history, the color illustrations weren't done specifically for these books. They were lifted and reused from other products, sometimes Dragon Magazine covers or whatever it may be, but they were reusing art all the time. So now the black and white stuff by Carl, I believe, was all original for this book, but all these color paintings are ones that I had seen publications somewhere else. All right, and then, cartography by Diesel. So as a reminder, that's Dave S. LaForce, who, and then, when you DSL, that's where the name Diesel comes from. So Dave LaForce was originally a more of like an illustrator for TSR, and then later on in his career stayed with the company and transitioned into cartography, which is really cool. So if memory serves, he's the one that did those really cool isometric maps in Module I6 Ravenloft, which was one of the first times I'd seen a map like that. I thought they were super cool. So I've heard people say that isometric maps are not as useful for a game, because it's a little bit, you can't print it out and put your counters on it or whatever. I don't care. It's like, as a dungeon master looking at it, having the elevation spelled out for me so I can see where everything is, I think is pretty cool. And I also don't use battle maps or figures. That's all theater of the mind. So having that 3D sort of image or isometric image is much easier for me. All right. And then lastly is typography by Nancy Kirkstra. I unfortunately couldn't find a lot about Nancy other than she did the typography for a lot of products from TSR during this era, including the 2nd edition Player's Handbook and other different products over the years. But one of the really fun things that I was able to find from Nancy, and it's just kind of a quick little thing, but and I did mention this in my video on Top Secret, but there was an adventure published for Top Secret that had pictures of like some of the NPCs and different characters that would be in that adventure. And the people that published it decided to use photos of actual employees of TSR at the time and put it into there. So this is was posted by Margaret Weiss, so famous from Dragonlance, right? So Dragonlance creator, writer, and she posted this picture. I found this on EN World, but and I didn't have this adventure at the time. But anyway, she shows this picture of all these people that used to work at TSR during this time period. So there's Kim Mulhan's on here, Jim Rosloff is on here, Margaret herself, Margaret Weiss, and then Nancy Kirkstra is here. And so that's at least we have a picture of her, but I have not been able to find out much else about Nancy. So again, if you guys are familiar with her and where her career ended up, please share that in the comments. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so let's keep going. And really quickly, if you like that kind of history of going over like the people that worked at TSR making these products and things like that, covering history of Dungeons and Dragons, TSR, also role-playing games in general, is something that is a major part of my channel here. So if that's something that you enjoy, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when when I upload new content. And if you could share this with your friends who maybe haven't watched my channel before, I would really appreciate it. It's a great way to help my channel grow. All right, so we're going to keep going here. And we're going to start. I'm just checking how much time I have left on my phone to record. Okay. All right. So we're going to get into the introduction really quickly. And this is going to be indicative of the way this book is going to be set up. So every chapter, for the most part, is going to start out with the italics here that you see on the left with in-game fiction. So I believe this is all written by Steve because he's the only sole author on this book. And he writes these stories where he creates these different characters, these NPCs. And what's fun is that those characters are going to appear in the back of the book. He's going to stat them out so that you could use them as examples or straight in use them as NPCs here. But the stories are pretty fun. So I tend to like normally skip past stuff like this. For whatever reason, I just normally don't read it, but I did read it for this, and it's actually pretty fun. It's well done, and it's very thematically appropriate for this particular book. So then then there's this little intro part after that. That, you know, this is again very indicative of the way these books were written in the second edition time period. Now, you guys have heard me say before that I'm a big fan of like old school essentials. And one of the reasons I like old school essentials is that it cuts all this kind of stuff out. It gets right to like, here's the stuff that you need to know to run this in your game. And there's like no flavor text pretty much at all, at least in the rule books and things like that. Adventures have a little bit more. And I'm going to show you at the end of this video, there's an example of an old school essentials product that was put out for a Necromancer class and show you just the economic way in which the information is presented. So one of the things in second edition that I did struggle with a lot was that you have to read through like layers of this text. Like it's very densely packed just to get to the information that you need. Now, it's not to say it's not well written. It's just, it doesn't necessarily always present the information in the easiest to use manner. All right, so we're going to go right down to how to use this book. And it says it's been designed for DMs who wish to create complex and memorable spellcasting foes for their unique campaigns. This book is divided into 3 main sections, each of which the DM may read separately in any order, but the chapters within you should read in sequence. They contain introductory material, such as that foreword that you just saw. That's the italic text, which may be read to the players to serve as inspiration for adversaries, or for adventure hooks, or used in other ways to help add further dimension of realism campaign. Okay, and then it says the first 4 chapters are devoted to the Necromancer non-player character. So remember that they're going to keep pointing that out, that this is for non-player characters. So chapter 1 is going to discuss rules for creating basic wizard necromancer as a separate and independent subclass. So during this time period, as a reminder, if you're not familiar with second edition too much, they present in the player's handbook a mage class and a wizard class that are subclasses of the wizard group. And they show the mage is the generalist. So in the old days would have been called a magic user. They call it mage in second edition. But the idea is they have access to every school. But but they don't get like bonus spells from a particular school. And then you have specialty wizards that can specialize in a particular school of magic. That was kind of a new thing in second edition, where they really kind of doubled down. Now, you'd had illusionist classes in first edition D&D, but that was the only example in the player's handbook that they gave you for a specialty wizard. And then in second edition, they kind of repeat that. They fully stat out, like, here's what an example would be of a specialty wizard. It's the illusionist. And they kept that in there because they'd had illusionists in first edition, but they only, in the player's handbook at least, they only do that for the illusionist. They mention how to create the other specialty wizards, but they don't go into as much detail as they did with the illusionist, which in second edition, illusionist would be called a subclass. Okay, and so what they're saying here is they're going to give the illusionist treatment to the School of Necromancy to show you how to create a necromancer specialist. Okay, and then they're going to give you 5 new kits: the Archetype, Anatomist, Death Slayer, Philosopher, Undead Master. And then, okay, so after talking about the kits, it mentions that it extends the powers of a necromancer by adding dual classes, psionic wild talents, and special powers from the patronage of dark gods. So once again, as a reminder, in this edition of Dungeons and Dragons, humans were not allowed to multi-class. So if they wanted to have more than one class, they had to do something called dual classing. And oddly enough, it's kind of similar to the way that multi-classing works in, like, say, third edition of Dungeons and Dragons, where at each level, you're one class or the other. Original multi-classing in these early editions of D&D, if you multi-class, like, say you were a dwarf fighter thief, as an example, you operated in both classes at the exact same time. You split your experience points exactly evenly, and you got all the advantages when you got to that particular level. So if you were a first level fighter, first level thief, you got the advantages of both. You took the better of the 2 saving throws, and then because each class had different saving throw progressions, and then you averaged your hit points for both classes. But other than that, I'm paraphrasing, but that's close enough. Humans had to dual class, and that meant they worked as one class, and then at a certain point they stopped being that class, and then they became a new class starting over at level 1. And all they did was keep their hit points from the prior class, but nothing else. And then once they surpassed the level of their original class, at that point, they were a dual class character, and they got the benefits of both. So again, that's shorthand. There's much more to it than that, but that's the gist. So they're basically saying they're going to have rules for necromancers to dual class. Psionic wild talents, those were introduced in the Complete Psionics Handbook. We talked about that briefly in the last video on all the complete different handbooks for second edition, and the dark gods. Okay, and it says also discuss undead or monsters as variants of the necromancer to challenge the most powerful or foolhardy group of adventurers. Chapter 3 talks about sacrifices that they have to make. Chapter 4, they expand the School of Necromancy, basically adding new spells. And then they switch tactics and move away from specialty necromancer wizards, and instead talk about basically death priests, clerics that follow gods of death or undeath or whatnot. And it goes through all that. There's necromantic priesthoods for gods of the dead, murder, pestilence, suffering, and the undead. And then chapter 6 has more priest spells. And then the final section of the book, this is really the kind of the DM section. So it talks about building necromancer and death priests into leaders and active participants in a campaign, fleshes out a necromancer's entourage with students, henchmen, familiars, and undead minions. And then it talks about tools and equipment. That does go a little bit back to player side, magical items, books of forbidden lore. And then it has descriptions of 7 detailed NPCs, which is pretty cool, and then appendices, and then in there a little bit also there's the Isle of the Necromancer Kings, which is that kind of mini campaign setting. All right, so that's the introduction, and then you have necromancy and the PC, and it talks about this is the section where it says, in general, the material presented in this tome is for the DM's eyes only. Necromancer put forward herein is a maverick, operating by a set of nasty rules that are completely beyond the realm of most normal, in quotes, player characters. The rules must be kept strictly hidden from the players even if they're adamant about portraying a necromancer. And it says the most obvious hindrance is alignment. And so, usually you don't want to have evil aligned characters. That was a big deal in second or edition and earlier. Necromancer PCs will face moral challenges from the onset of their career, starting probably with their mentor. And then it talks about how your mentor might mistreat you because they're evil. And so trying to learn new spells could be a hassle. And then it kind of gives you the story of this character called Talib that he's created that's going to appear in that kind of fiction stuff at the beginning of each section. And then it talks about Necromancer PCs that reach 9th level are potential threats to game balance because they gain the ability to cast Animate Dead. And that's a problem that the DM would have to try to handle. Okay. And then, it goes on to talking about, half the adventure would be reduced to the necromancer sending minions into the dungeon. And so they're trying to give you reasons why you shouldn't allow this stuff. So it basically says if you do that, the necromancer could send zombies, mindless undead to go do all the scary things so that the thief doesn't accidentally die trying to spring a trap. You just send a zombie in to spring the trap and who cares what happens to them. And so he talks about that. And then he says necromancer PCs are already powerful enough. So again, those are the specialty wizards that have chosen to specialize in the school of necromancy. And it's like splitting hairs, but that is different than the kind of necromancer that they're talking about for this book, because this book is, again, going to give them extra goodies. And they're saying those goodies should not be allowed to PCs. Keep in mind that you as DM must choose an appropriate power and penalties for the character, taking into account game balance and role playing and all that kind of stuff. So, this is all the kind of stuff, like I was saying, that the fact that they have to put this whole section here to tell you that PC shouldn't use this, it's also giving you, again, if you kind of read between the lines, it's giving you tips on how you can handle using these powers for a PC. Okay, so then it goes into what you need, and it says you'd need the player's handbook, DM's guide. And then it talks about a lot of other books in the series. And that's another thing that's going to pop up in this particular book all the time is constant mentions of other D&D books that have come out that you might want to have access to. So in this particular case, they're saying you would do well if you had access to the Tome of Magic, the Complete Shire's Handbook, which was another handbook written specifically for the Arabian Adventures campaign setting, Al-Qadim. And that is the Shire is already a wizard kit, and then they got their own book that has their own kits in it. So it's a really interesting thing. I can cover that at some point if anybody's interested. Just let me know down in the comments below. And then Complete Wizard's Handbook. So we talked about that last time in that last video. The Complete Priest Handbook, same thing. Arabian Adventures, we just mentioned that. And then the Forgotten Realms Adventures hardcover book. So they're saying that it'd be great if you had all those, but you can probably get by without it. All right, so now we're going to get into this first section here, chapter 1 on Necromancer. So again, you've got your flavor text to kick things off. And then it talks about one of the main purposes of this book is to facilitate NPC generation for the DM. To that end, we begin by summarizing the general requirements and abilities of wizards specializing in the art of necromancy. Detractors of this school more commonly refer to necromancy as the dark, black, or forbidden arts. Okay, so that's very much in keeping with pulp style, those early pulp fiction stories. And that actually is going to influence the presentation of the material in here. You get the sense, I mentioned in one of my previous videos that I really liked reading the Conan the Barbarian stories when I was younger, and that style of book. And in those books, any kind of magic user is almost always an evil character, and it's the person for Conan, the adversary for Conan to defeat. And they're always trying to, make treaties with ancient elder weird god things and all this kind of stuff. And they're always bad. And so the way that the necromancers are presented in here, it's that kind of aesthetic. It's these evil, they're almost like priest kings, and that's what the death priest would be. But even the wizard necromancers are presented in that kind of light. So it goes through the ability scores that you would need, what races you can be, and it basically says you can only be human, and then there's going to be some exceptions later on, but not for player characters, again, for NPCs only. experience levels and advancement, and then the kind of spells that you might want to pick. And then this table over here is basically telling you the different methods. There are multiple methods for generating ability scores presented in second edition. And each one of them is going to give you different odds on getting the kind of character that you want, because you're rolling your scores randomly. You're not using a point buy or whatever like you would do in a lot of later editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And so it's showing you the odds and telling you which method is more likely to get you the kind of character that you want if you're going to play a Necromancer, or if the DM's going to create one. And that's another thing that's really interesting about this. And again, if you read between the lines, because the Dungeon Master creating an NPC is not going to sit there and figure out which method to roll and then roll the stats. They're going to assign the stats that they need for the NPC to be what they want them to be. I don't see a DM randomly rolling until they get the right score so that you could create a Necromancer. But they're showing you how to do that here. And for me, again, I think that's more about like if you're a PC and you want to be a PC, it's just they're not saying that. So then it talks about spell restrictions. So one of the things that necromancers have restrictions to are they can't cast spells from the School of Illusion or the School of Enchantment or Charm. So every specialty wizard has opposition schools from spells that they can't cast, and those are the ones for necromancers. And then magic item restrictions that they can and can't use. They talk about proficiencies. So these are weapon but also non-weapon proficiencies. And then you're going to get into your new Necromancer Wizard kits. So here's some really interesting stuff. I love this part. So the first one that they represent is the archetypal necromancer. Fine, it's just your standard necromancer. But look at this last paragraph down here on the right-hand side of this, the second page. The archetypal necromancer was perhaps best captured in the short stories of Clark Ashton Smith, and then goes on to, and a lot of these names I can't even pronounce, the decadent Mamat Moore of Sodosma from the Empire of the Necromancers, the powerful Vacharn and his treacherous sons Vokal and Uldola from the Necromancy of Naat, the vengeful Nether from the Colossus of Lorn, and finally the perverted Abrion Thaw with his timid assistants Nargai and Vemba Sith from the Charnel God. So anyway, he's recommending inspirational texts and media that you should consume in order to help get in the mindset of creating necromancers. And I love this because it's a huge theme of my blog. So when I started my blog, one of the things that I wanted to do was write about the inspirations that I took from all kinds of different areas, fiction and nonfiction and movies and TV and music and all that, and how it influenced my ongoing campaign. I'm talking about my long running campaign that's been going on for over 20 years now, almost 25. And this book in particular, more so than I think any other book in the complete handbook series, goes into those types of influences and inspirations, and I love it. And I love that he's recommending Clark Ashton Smith. So interestingly enough, I was confused. I was going to show you guys how Clark Ashton Smith was listed in the Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, first edition, and he's not. And I, for some reason, always had it in my head that he was. So if you are familiar with the BX module, the 1981 BX version of Dungeons and Dragons, module X2 Castle Amber, that is directly influenced by Clark Ashton Smith's stories. And so if you've ever played that or run it, you'll get a sense of what those stories are like. And so the author here is highly recommending that you check those out. So that's the archetypal necromancer, and it just gets in the requirements and the role and the preferred spells that they'd have, weapon proficiencies. Again, everything's presented in that very similar format of the kits from the other books that you saw in the previous video, if you've seen that. Okay, and then you get into the Anatomist, and this is a kit that it specifically tells you, and I'm going to come over here. I'm in the middle column, the left column of the right-hand page. And it says, the Anatomist is chiefly inspired by the physicians of the 15th to 19th centuries who increasingly tuned to the dissection of cadavers to improve their medical expertise. And that talks about how there was laws in place. And so that, a lot of times they got in trouble for stealing corpses until laws were put in place to give them access to corpses so that they could study them. And then it says Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, written in 1817, drew further parallels between the genius physician and the experimenting necromancer. So it says it works best in campaigns with a Renaissance background or a 16th century historical setting, such as the one proposed in A Mighty Fortress. So again, they're name dropping a product that you might want to have access to, and that is one of the historical guides. I was talking about those earlier, those green historical books. A Mighty Fortress was one of the first ones that I got. I loved that one because I loved advancing the timeline. And it says an evil anatomist would perfectly suit a Ravenloft campaign replete with mad scientists and their abhorrent creatures. And then he talks about for ideas on more twisted aspects of the kit, you can refer to the classic Frankenstein, numerous B-horror movies, and Van Richten's Guide to the Created. So yet another product that was for the Ravenloft campaign setting, the Van Richten's Guide. And then he says there's a Thieves' World story, The Vivisectionist, which closely it explores this whole thing. So again, I love that they're giving you tools and inspiration to like read more and be inspired by, in this particular case, it's mostly fiction, but also other games and other game products. It's interesting that they name drop Ravenloft, of course. It's a perfect fit for this type of book and this type of content, talking about necromancers. So, and again, at the time period, Ravenloft first becomes its own setting, I think it was 1990 with Realms of Dread box set, turning that module, the original module I6, Ravenloft, which came out in 1983, and now by 1990 it's so popular that it had become its own setting at TSR. But Ravenloft was one of the influences, as well as like Call of Cthulhu, for White Wolf to make Vampire the Masquerade. And Vampire the Masquerade was kind of getting popular around this time, first debuted in 1991. So Necromancer, this book of the Necromancers, comes out in 1995. So all those kinds of things, like that sort of horror role-playing was sort of having a moment. And so this book fits right into that. And so it makes a lot of sense that they're going to name drop Ravenloft a few times in this particular section. Okay, so then it just goes on into the requirements. Again, the role that they play, their preferred spells, that the standard stuff that we've been talking about. So again, I'm not going to go through detail on these, but I mainly wanted to talk about just what the kits were, and then where the author Steve Kurtz is recommending that you get inspiration for playing these. So the Death Slayer comes up next. And it talks about, they devote his or her life to the destruction of undead, striving always to rid the living world of their abominable existence. Okay, so this section is so much fun. Okay, so it says, in addition to the various Van Richten's guides, the original Dr. Van Helsing, on whom Van Richten's character is based, from Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Parl Dro, the ghost killer from Tanithly's Kill the Dead, are sources of inspiration for this kit. The popular comic book hero Batman provides an interesting example of the Death Slayer's personality. As a child, Bruce Wayne's parents were murdered by street thugs, inspiring him to devote his life to combating criminals. As a hero, Batman never killed the bad guys, in quotes, but he may have smacked them around a bit, but he never killed them. The interesting thing about Batman's character, of course, is that he wants to kill all the evil villains he defeats. He craves revenge, but he must continually fight an inner struggle to master his darker desires. So I thought that was really fun, especially as a comic book guy. It also they talk about Elric of Melniboné, perhaps the first fantasy anti-hero, making pacts with evil gods and employing black necromancy to save his beloved, only to inadvertently slay her with a malevolent artifact. And then the recent film The Crow. I remember seeing that in the theater, the Brandon Lee one. Not so when it says recent, obviously, I mean the recent one that came out. I haven't seen that one. But this is like the 93 movie, I think, is when the original Crow came out. The Revenant is a little different from his murderers, whom the vengeful spirit hunts down and brutally kills. Ultimately, nothing prevents the Death Slayer from adopting the same loathsome practices as his or her enemies. Anyway, again, really kind of some cool stuff. And it really starts to help, I think, add some color and some context to these names that are not all that evocative. So Death Slayer to me is a very, I don't want to say it's a lazy name, but it doesn't really evoke a lot of exciting ideas for me. But then when you read the description and how they're talking about it, and they're talking about Batman and Van Helsing and the Crow and all those things, like, okay, I see what's going on here. And I can start like percolating ideas of like how I might involve this in a campaign. But again, I think the name Death Slayer is just kind of generic, as is the name, the archetypal Necromancer. I don't know what kind of names I was hoping they would have come up with, but they're just a little on the boring side. It's one of my very few nitpicks about this book. Okay, so now you've got this great painting over here. This is by Rob, like I said, it's Ruppel, not sure. But I really like this painting. So that would be an anatomist, obviously, on the left-hand side. Okay, so then you have the Philosopher. And again, I was like, not sure, when you read just the name, but then you get into it. Numerous examples of this kit can be found in the short stories of H.P. Lovecraft and his literary successors, for whom this character became something of a stereotype. And then as soon as that, I'm like, oh, I see. It's not the kind of, I was thinking of a philosopher that kind of debates the, life and death and all that kind of thing. And it's not that at all. It's more of like your I don't want to say mad scientist, but they're going to get there. So Lovecraft was noted for creating the fictional Necronomicon that, drives people crazy. And horror writers have expanded on the notion of the demented scholar or sage. And then they name drop Clark Ashton Smith again. So clearly Steve Kurtz really likes Clark Ashton Smith. This is like the second of about maybe, 8-9 times that he's going to bring him up. Door in the Darkness and Beyond the Threshold by August Derleth, Shambler from the Stars and Shadow from the Steeple by Robert Bloch, Tears from the Depth by Fritz Leiber. So all great stuff. And like this is this book alone, the Necromancer book, will give you sort of like an alternative Appendix N of things to read if you're trying to create this kind of atmosphere in your game. So I really enjoyed that. So a lot of these books are ones that I've either, sought out or I've put like on a list to try to track down and read, or, listen to an audiobook version and that kind of stuff. So a lot of stuff like this I've found. Sometimes you can find people reading them on YouTube, so you're not getting visuals, you're just getting the story. And I'll listen to it like during my morning walks. Okay, so that is the Philosopher, and then you have the Undead Master. Again, not a great name, but it says they can be found again in Clark Ashton Smith stories, the Necromancer Malagris from The Last Incantation, and the Vengeful Nemira from the Dark Eidolon make ideal models. The DM might check out another great one, Glenn Cook's Black Company series, which involves a necromancer known as the Dark Lady who subjugates her living apprentices, creating the infamous 10 who were taken. So just a brief aside here, I highly recommend you check out Glenn Cook's Black Company series. So there's a ton of them. I've actually only read the first trilogy, which I believe is the Books of the South. I think I know there's other ones, but really great writing, very descriptive. I love his naming conventions where things are described rather than given some kind of like fake fantasy names. So as you see here, the Dark Lady, the 10 who were taken. Those names to me are so much more creative and, I hate to keep using the word evocative, but more so than, a name with a lot of apostrophes and consonants in it that is almost impronounceable. That starts to kind of break reality because then I'm stumbling over how to pronounce it. And it also doesn't paint a picture of what that thing is. But the Dark Lady, I know exactly who that person is, like in my head, right? And but more than that, it's just a really great story. It's like a mercenary company, and the story is told for the most part through the annals of the mercenary historian is writing down like their deeds, because they have to keep these records for future generations of this mercenary group that's a famous group in the world, and over time, it's like a different historian because, people get old and died. It's like the timeline advances. And anyway, I would highly recommend checking out also Gary Gygax. And I forget where he was quoted in this, but at a certain point later in life, he mentioned that had the Black Company been published and had he read it at the time when he wrote the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, he would have put it into his Appendix N of that. But that's how much he enjoyed it. So definitely check that out. Okay, so that's the Undead Master. Art here by Carl Waller, and if I don't recall if this is the first one we've seen, but it's the first one that jumped out at me. But again, you see that comic book aesthetic, that comic book style. And I think, once you see that again, it's no surprise that he worked in the comic book field as well as in role-playing games. Okay, so that's the Undead Master, and then you have other Necromancer kits, and it mentions that there's kits from other books that might be helpful. And so it mentions the Academician, the Militant Wizard, the Peasant Wizard, the Savage Wizard, and the Witch. All of those from the Complete Wizard's Handbook. And then the Astrologer, Ghoul Lord, and the Mystic of Nog, which is from the Shire's Handbook. And then it goes on to say that the Witch and the Ghoul Lord in particular are probably the most interesting ones. And then they describes them. And again, I love this stuff. So he's like, the Witch specializes in communicating with the dead. And so they're learning spells, with invisible spirits, hidden secrets about the physical world. And the Witch, you might call them a medium or a spirit channeler. And again, I think that, if you're doing sort of that late time period setting that he was talking about earlier, like, at least in the Renaissance, if not later, calling them a medium or a spirit channeler, but using stats of a witch, I think would be very, very cool. And it says it's an interesting, distinctive kit for necromancers. The spells are taught to the witch by spirits rather than by a living mentor. And then right there, that's world building. It's so many cool ideas for a player character that wants to have a witch. The fact that you're learning your spells from spirits, it starts to kind of get close to sounding like a warlock from 5th edition, but, whatever. And then it says, the witch is basically an envoy and intermediary between the living and the dead. And then, in ancient societies, consultation of the dead through the witch or a medium was a common practice. And then he talks about the Greeks and the Celts and gets into all the things of they're wearing, skin pelts of magical animals. Like, this is all great stuff that you can use to help you world build when you're trying to figure out the role of necromancers and witches in your campaign. It talks about Roman times, Middle Ages, and how they, they started to get negative and evil stereotypes cast on them. And, anyway, I really like that. It's really cool. And then you get the Ghoul Lord here. This is from the Complete Shire's Handbook. And they're necromancers who channel the dangerous energies of the negative material plane. So they don't cast spells like normal wizards. They employ the raw manipulations of negative energy that can be used to attack, defend, provide transport, and yield information. So the Shire is a really interesting character. We're not going to get into the mechanics of that, but it's a little fiddly. Their spellcasting is not as easy as it is for a wizard. It takes them longer to cast spells and things like that. They basically have to, the gist of it is they have to kind of ask for the spell that they want and send something off to go get the spell and bring it back. That's my memory. I haven't looked at that book forever. And so that's built into the mechanics of the class in terms of how long it takes to cast a spell. It's not instantaneous. So it says the Ghoul Lord pays a terrible price for their powers. The negative energy slowly twists and corrupts the user's body, eventually turning them into hideous monstrosity as the wizard progresses in experience. And since the powers involve the channeling of negative energy, they can't try manipulations that duplicate spells outside of the school of necromancy. So that's your Ghoul Lord. And so kind of cool. I like that. It's a neat idea. So yeah, and then you get to your non-weapon proficiencies. And so they add some new ones in here. So you have anatomy, necrology, netherworld, spirit lore, venom handling, some more art here. And then you get into your dual class characters. So this basically just tells you how would you combine a necromancer with a fighter, a thief, or a cleric. And basically the fighter's kind of the easiest one, it says. Then it says the thief is kind of pointless because the necromancer spells kind of duplicate a lot of the things that the thief can do. And the thief isn't that much better of a fighter or has higher hit points than a standard wizard. So there's really little point to doing that. And then it says the cleric necromancer is very difficult because it's difficult to generate. And so this is, again, talking about if you're a DM creating a high level cleric necromancer, there's a lot of work to do to put that together. And so that's that section. Then it has the psionicist necromancer. And then again, the wild talents that you might have for that. Then it gets into vile pacts and dark gifts. And so it goes through here and talks about special powers. So basically what it says is do not use these for your player characters, but if you want to assign them to your NPCs, it suggests roughly one every 4 levels. So a 12th level necromancer could have like 3 of these powers, but it's giving them additional abilities on top of like everything else that they get to just kind of make them a little bit more unique and also a little bit more deadly in a combat. So animal form, augmented hit points, chilling touch. I'm not going to go over all these, but you get the idea. Some really fun kind of cool stuff in there. And then it talks about non-human necromancers, and it goes into it really breaks it down into talking mostly about drow and Githyanki, but it addresses orcs as well. So it says orcs and also dragons. So the humanoids, it says like, orcs, bugbears, gnolls, hobgoblins, goblins embrace violence and death. But a tribal wizard, which is a member of the Savage Wizard kit from the Wizard's Handbook. Again, we talked about that last time. They might be able to have access to some of this stuff. But then it goes into the drow. It goes into the draconic necromancers, the Githyanki ones. So all these are kind of like cool stories where they're giving you like history of like why they do this. And totally makes sense for the Githyanki because they worship sort of like a necromancer queen. Or like, she's, they pay homage to, it says eternal homage to an undying necromancer queen. And so obviously they would have necromancers. That makes sense. And it gets into a little bit more about their society and how that works. It talks about how a lot of sorcerers would try to, it says sorcerers, but again, necromancers, how they're going to extend their life through magic means so that they can continue casting spells. Then it talks about undead necromancers and death priests. And then this chapter is really interesting. So this is going to go into what they call the social stigma of using necromancy and how that might affect your player character. Before we get into the section on the price, I would like to ask that if you are able to and would like to support my channel, the 2 best ways of doing that right now would be to become a super fan. So just click that little logo that you see near the title of the video of the heart with the $sign in it. And you can join these other really nice folks that have helped contribute to my channel. And then also you could buy something from my shop, a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, etc. I do have a new design in the shop, which is inspired by the classic white box edition of original Dungeons and Dragons from 1974, and that's in honor of the 50th anniversary of the release of Dungeons and Dragons, since we're in 2024 right now. But I also have other designs in my shop as well, and that's a great way that you can support the channel. There's links to do all that in the show notes below. All right, so let's look at the price. So this is it's an interesting chapter, and I think Steve does a really good job of navigating this because there's some stigma behind, like in the old days, like as an example, the Wicked Witch of the West, like, somebody who's ugly or has warts or is deformed, there was an association with like that person is an evil person. And that's an unfortunate period of history where people were judged based on things like that. And so there was a little bit of like nuance to this that had to be navigated in order to present this in the correct way. And I think Steve does a great idea because basically what he says is, no, it's the evil that kind of you're evil already, like at heart. And it's because of that, it's what causes these things to happen. So, some groups might not be comfortable with this, and that's completely okay. And it would definitely be something you'd want to discuss. And like, if you have a session 0 or just a chat before you start playing the game of things that you do and don't want to deal with. But I think that's handled pretty well in this, especially considering the time period when this was written, where a lot of people just wouldn't even address something like this and talk about it. And here it is addressed. So, it talks about you might experience severe public discrimination when your profession becomes known. Even just the fact of being a necromancer could cause people to treat you poorly. And so he goes into that, and then also talks about insanity or madness. So this is very like there's a connection here with like Call of Cthulhu again. That's a big part of that particular game. Now, I've talked before in my game, the way I handle this, in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, I call it composure. So things can cause you to lose your composure, like stress, seeing something that you're not supposed to see, or, reading a forbidden volume of text or forbidden documents, or just being exposed to, something horrible happens to you, like you, you get attacked and you almost die or something like that. And so all those things cause you to potentially lose your composure. And I used to have a table. So when I first started out, I was like, okay, there's a table. Then once you lose your composure, you can roll on this table to see like what happens, how it affects you. And I thought like that, it wasn't working. Like it wasn't narratively. It didn't always make sense. Like the result on the table of like what happened to you didn't always match the cause of what would have caused the person to lose composure. And so now I let the players narrate it, and they actually enjoy that so much more. They're at the point where they want to lose composure because they want to come up with a way of describing how their character's going to act now, or like maybe their character has a scar, or like whatever it is. They want to describe that to me and to their friends rather than having me tell them what happened. And so I think that works. I like it. And it avoids a lot of potential issues that I think could happen if somebody were to roll on the table and get a result that maybe hit a little too close to home of something that was like maybe really affecting them or whatever. I don't always know 100% like what's going on with these people that I'm playing with. And so I don't want to do anything that's going to set them off. So I think letting them describe it works better. But they give you a lot of ideas in this book. And I think that, that's the standard stuff that, phobias and melancholy, delusion, paranoia, all that kind of stuff, hallucinations. I do like to use hallucinations a lot, caused by, hallucinogenic compounds in the game and things like that. But again, a lot of times they'll say, well, tell me what you see. Tell me what you think you see. And I'll let them, and like one of them, she loves just jumping out of her chair to act it out. Okay, so, and then you have your unholy compulsions that might happen. So, it's a pretty neat section. It's very thematically appropriate. And again, I think, for the time it was handled pretty well. Okay, so then you get into your spell selections. That's what this section is, basically. And then it's talking about, is it criminal? Is it black necromancy? Like all this kind of stuff. And then it talks about gray and neutral necromancy, and then benign or white necromancy. And that's a thing I think a lot of times people forget. Not all necromancers have to be evil. Certain spells that are cast for a good purpose actually belong to the school of necromancy. So you're not always evil. And they address that. And then they just add some new spells in here. Now, interestingly, some of the spells that are going to get introduced in this section have appeared in later editions of D&D after the publication of this particular book in 1995. So something like Death Pact, which is going to show up in 3rd edition. Death Ward, it's handled differently, but sort of the inspiration, I guess you could say, for it shows up in 3.5. It shows up in 5th edition. Summon Undead is going to show up later in 5th edition. I think it's in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. So, but a lot of that stuff gets its start here. So that's what this section is. It's just the spells. Unfortunately, there's no list of spells. So you have to just, read them through in level order, which is kind of frustrating. Okay, then you get to your Death Priests section. And so I skipped over the spells pretty quickly, and one of the reasons I'm doing that, it was deliberate, because I'm trying not to show every single page in here, because I feel that's a little dishonest. Like, at this point, you guys might want to look into seeing if you could purchase it yourself if you want to get the PDF, right? So I got it for $6. It was on sale, so it's pretty reasonable. But in any event, so it gets into the Death Priest, and then it talks about, again, he goes into the history. Long before magicians learned how to practice the art, priests were worshiping death in its varied forms. In Eastern societies, death was personified as an active agent of the world, symbolized by the rise and fall of the river and the fury of raging tempest, or in the jaws of a crocodile. Talks about Hindus. He talks about Nordic society. Death and pestilence were personified by Hel, Hel, another feminine deity. And then he talks about, other cultures. He talks about China and Mesopotamia, Celtic Europe, Mesoamerica, Egypt, Greek. Like, I'm a history guy, and so like the fact that he took space out of this thing to talk about the actual historical inspirations for this chapter, loved it. I just thought it was great. And then here we are back to our friend Clark Ashton Smith. I'm in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd column of text. In the Charnel God, he talks about the worship of a ravening ghoul god by the name of Mordigian, I think it is, a creature who feasts upon the remains of the dead. So he goes into that. He's got H.P. Lovecraft in here again, talking about that, Robert Bloch. And so again, I'm a fan of that kind of level of, it's not even detail. It's just, it's showing you the inspirations for why the things that you're going to read are created and crafted and designed the way that they were. And it's because the inspirations came from a lot of history stuff and then the specific fictional inspirations that he gives you. So then he talks about the different priesthoods. So this is going to be set up in a similar manner to the Complete Priest Handbook of designing these priesthoods. And so then he gets into the God of the Dead, and then talks about, what the priests are going to be like what kind of armor and dresses allowed, what kind of alignment you have to be, all that kind of stuff. So these essentially almost become like kits in and of themselves, right? You can see you've got your non-weapon proficiencies, what roles you play, what spheres of influence you have. Spheres is like the priest version of schools in second edition. What kind of powers you're going to get. That's going to be like your special benefits, your other limitations. So again, very much like a kit. You've got the goddess of murder. And so, which is a fun idea, pretty cool. You've got the god of pestilence. So, plague priests. That to me, that's very Warhammer-like. I kind of think of something like that. Is it Nurgle? Is he the plague god from Warhammer? I forget. And then the god of suffering. So this is a really interesting section, and it takes a little reading into it to kind of get what maybe he was getting at. But he says the lot of humanity is to suffer and shed tears, and this god embodies all the pain and misery in the world. Prolonged and agonizing life is merely the prelude to a long-awaited death that brings final comfort and release in all forms. Okay, basically these are flagellants. So priests of the crying god, most commonly known as flagellants, are wandering ministers of pain and consolation. There's a very medieval Western Christian church kind of thing going on with this idea of flagellants and making yourself suffer because your God suffered, right? I'm pretty sure that's what he was going for here. And, this isn't, it's not historical or anything like that. This is a fantasy game, but I think there's some inspiration there from some real world practices, from again, the Middle Ages. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, and then you have the Lord of the Undead. So the King of Ghouls, basically, it talks about that. So these are all really neat. I think they're very flavorful. Again, the names aren't always all of that evocative. And again, I realize I've used that word 18 times, but the Lord of the Undead is not a great name to me, but the flavor of the priesthood is actually really cool. So I would say the Ghoul God is a better name than the Lord of the Undead, or there it says is a ravenous deity. You could do something with that. Some great art over here on the right-hand side. And then you get your new priest spells. A lot of these are very, very similar to the wizard necromancer spells that we saw earlier. They're just described differently. Of course, mechanically, they're slightly different. A lot of times the level will be different, but not all of them, but a lot of them are very much the same. So, so that's that section. We're going to skip past that. And then, now we're going to get into our section on basically your helpers. So apprentices, and it talks all about how to attract apprentices that you're going to train, and then henchmen. So these are people that you pay, unlike apprentices that come seek you out so you can teach them. Henchmen are people that you hire to do certain tasks, your basic stuff. But again, this is all stuff that is applicable to pretty much any edition of the game. So, that was one of the things I wanted to mention about this particular book. As you've seen, as you're going through this, so much of this is stuff that you could stick into a 5e game or a Dungeon Crawl Classics game or a Shadow Dark game or a Mirkborg game, or, aka Morkborg, whatever you want to call that. All this stuff, I think would fit in. That Suffering God, I think fits right in with that Mirkborg sort of aesthetic. So, this is a great section, familiars and the kind of familiars that you would get. And then it tells you animals such as the crow, raven, serpent, hyena, vulture, and weasel are most appropriate. But then it talks about, well, what if you get an imp from the lower planes, and how would you attract it? And what would it be like? And then he tells you about, it doesn't always have to look the way that it's described in the monster map. Maybe it looks different, and there's reasons for that. And so instead of looking like an annoying 2-foot tall fiend, something akin to Jabba the Hutt's maniacally cackling pet in the film The Empire Strikes Back. So that wasn't The Empire Strikes Back. That was in Return of the Jedi, and that maniacally cackling pet, that was Salacious Crumb. I forget the race. I used to have the race memorized of what that was, but Anyway, but it could appear as a shadowy winged creature with glowing red eyes. That's cool. Like, and so he's telling you how to like adapt these things. And I thought that was really neat. Then it talks about undead minions, shadows, and the crawling claws, zombies, ghouls, ghast, juju zombies, crypt things, all really good stuff. All right. And then we're going to get into the section on secret societies. So this section is just great. So secret societies, and it talks about like basically just how to create one. So this is just DM advice. It really doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with, with necromancers. So in this particular case, it talks about like how it provides training and support, information, and contact with like-minded allies. And then he describes some of the ones from typical D&D settings. So he's got like the evil 10th pit opposing the pragmatic order of thought from Spelljammer, the Zentarim and the Harpers from the Forgotten Realms, the Veiled Alliance from Dark Sun, the Land of Fate has the Incendiary Brotherhood of the True Flame. So talks about all of that and then gets into like, what do you need to know about the society? Well, what are the privileges of membership? What are the rites of passage? What are the goals? And then he goes into like all these really fun ones. So of course these ones are tied to, the necromancers, but again, that advice for how to build them and things to think about is applicable to any kind of, secret society that you were going to be making. So he's got the Cult of Worms, the Scabrous Society, the Cult of Pain, the Anatomical Academy. It's just really fun. Okay. Now tools of the trade, probably, and again, this is not a dig, but it's probably the weakest part of this book. And it's just because the other stuff is so good. So, not everything can be a 10 out of 10. And this, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's just, it's a little kind of generic and pedestrian. So, it's fine. It talks about poisons and potions, which is cool. I like that stuff. I like using poison in a game. I don't think it gets used often enough. And partly I remember in the 3E days, at least, we never used poison because everyone's saving throws were so high that they always survived the poison. So I like when poison is dangerous. So I have some different things that I do for my game that I run for my daughter and her friends. But then it's got some magical items here. Again, nothing horrible. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, again, it's not all that, evocative. I guess if you were playing a drinking game, you could take a drink every time I said evocative today, or something like that. All right. Or, play like Punch Buggy or something, but with that word. So here is our little kind of like, I think it's sort of like a mini campaign setting. Sahu, Homeland of the Necromancer Kings. And so you've got your map over here on the right-hand side. And then he describes a campaign on an island of necromancers. It's really interesting. It's really fun. So I really dug it. So this is a sample campaign with guidelines for creating a detailed and convoluted storyline. I thought that was an interesting word choice, convoluted, lasting for many adventures. And it's got adventure hooks and all kinds of stuff in here. And then he's going to detail some NPC necromancers that have been mentioned in these stories that we've been talking about. So again, you've got your Isle of the Necromancer Kings, and then you've got your twin villages of Mizbad and Janut, and all kinds of Iron Spires and Colossus of Uruk, capital of the Necromancer Kings. It's not super long, but it's really flavorful. I liked it a lot. And then now you've got your NPCs. So these are all, again, the characters that have been described. And the text here is really tiny. So it's not super fun to read. But you've got a human necromancer anatomist over here on the left. That's Alondra, and she's neutral. And then you have Kazarabet, who's probably the most common NPC used in that flavor text early on. So there's a lot of things where it's like she's written a book and they're quoting from her book. Kind of an interesting story, but she's an angel of the dark, former queen of Asawis. And she's a 20th level human necromancer philosopher. So again, one of those kind of like H.P. Lovecraft sort of, probably has read and seen things that humans were not meant to. But she's lawful neutral, so again, not evil. And then you got to this guy, Pezentios. I think he's the most evil of the group here. Pezentios of the Ghoul's Skin, Shadow Master. He's a human necromancer, and then he's the archetypal necromancer. So he is lawful evil. And then you have Sarzek, the broken captain of the can't read that, Scrofula, 6th level human necromancer. He's an undead master. Okay, and then you have Talib. This is another kind of one that comes up quite a bit, and it's because he has a connection to that, I forgot her name, Kazarabet. So Talib kind of has some connections with her. So King Talib al-Isawis, the Magnificent and the Accursed, dual class human. He's a 5th level desert warrior and a 16th level necromancer. So if memory serves, Desert Warrior is a warrior kit from, I don't think it's the Complete Fighter's Handbook. It might be from like the Al-Qadim Arabian Adventures. It could be from that particular book. I have that book. I just didn't pull it off the shelf. Okay, and then and he is chaotic good, interestingly enough. And then you have Vermissa, the Undying One, Queen of Worms, Matron of Ghouls, 24th level priestess, and she's a charnalist, it says. I think that's what it says. Let's try to increase the size there so I can actually read without squinting. Yeah, that's what she is. So anyway, that's her. And that's going to kind of wrap up. Oh, there's one more. There's Yola, the Pain Mistress, Yolanda Shamat, 8th level human death priestess of pain. So again, this is all those earlier priesthoods that they identified here. And then it gets into, lists like appendices, common spells for necromancers, what spells would you cast? And then it kind of tells you like what books they come from, whether, Wizard's Handbook or the Forgotten Realms book or the Tome of Magic, like all that kind of stuff. All right. And then your appendices 2 and 3. So wizard spells, necromancy. So this is all the necromantic spells by level. And then that's going to be your back cover right there. And that is going to be it for this particular book. Now, one of the things I did mean to show you is how Old School Essentials, I mentioned, handles using necromancers. So this is their necromancer book that came out. This is actually a playtest version. So if memory serves, they offer this for free. But you can just see the, it says playtest content presented as development content for playtesting. So I used ideas from this for the Necromancer. Those are my daughter's game this last weekend as well. But you see here, like, again, I'm talking about the economy of words to convey a lot of the same information. Now, is it as fun to read like as the other stuff? Maybe not. People say Old School Essentials is kind of dry, like it doesn't have any flavor to it. That's deliberate. That's on purpose. That's part of the way that this is created. So there is plenty of flavor stuff. If you look at settings, things like Dolmenwood, or again, a lot of the adventures like Halls of the Blood King is really great and very flavorful. But as far as like presenting rules for playing a class, I don't think you need all that. So it just says wizards who deal with the macabre mysteries of death and undeath are a staple of sword and sorcery fiction and fantasy gaming. So in one sentence says what it took, 6 paragraphs to say in that other book. And again, that's not a dig. That was the design aesthetic of second edition. So it had to follow that format. And they all did that. All those books did that. So then it talks about, what kind of magic they cast. And then here's your class. And then, once this hits public, like there would be art here. So, they just haven't done that. There's your spell lists, and then there's some new spells. And that's it. So I liked the way that was presented. It was, it's very easy to read. So just wanted to give you a different example of another necromancer. But I really like this book. I love this particular book here because of the flavor, and I particularly like the inspirations. I like all the times that they mentioned, like, what was the source for creating this particular thing, whether it was fiction or Earth history or a movie like The Crow and things like that. I thought was really, really cool. It was very interesting, and gave me ideas of things to read so that I could create some more, scary and flavorful, like, thematic stuff for a session that's, I don't do like gore and stuff in my games. One of my players really doesn't like that, but they're okay with like being scared. And so I try to create atmospheric stuff that is scary more so than like body horror stuff. So, this is a great book for trying to figure that kind of stuff out. So some of the people have said, I've seen some reviews of people even at the time that thought like that, this didn't go far enough. They thought it was very sort of clinical in its approach, and that, they didn't like all the historical stuff. They wanted more like out there fantasy. They did want that body horror kind of like, because necromancers are doing stuff like that, right? They're grafting, different bodies together and stuff like that. And they felt like this book didn't go far enough. I think that's fine, because most of other books don't do what this book does. So there's a place for both of those kinds of things. I gravitate more towards something like this, but that's just my particular style. So I think that, a lot of times, especially when you're trying to, recreate this type of genre, this like kind of scary, where you're creating anxiety in your players and things like that, like having a very creative and flavorful description of something that's happening that they don't quite understand what it is, versus telling them that like someone's, body parts are being chopped up and stuff like that. Like, to me, it's like the difference between something like watching like a Sixth Sense. It's maybe not the best example, but that versus like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, both can be scary, but they're scary in different ways. And to me, one of them has a much more long-term psychological impact on the viewer. And for me, that would be Sixth Sense, versus something where right away that it's fake. There's no way they can make it look that good. And it just kind of, to me, pulls me out of the immersion. But that's not a slam against it. If anybody likes Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's great. It's just not my style. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on this particular book. Thanks to the folks who wrote. It was your comments saying that I forgot. I always get a chuckle when people say I forget, because the automatic assumption is because I didn't mention something that I forgot, as opposed to that it just didn't fit the narrative that I was trying to say. But those comments did give me the idea to kind of cover this, because it's a great book. And again, I think with Halloween coming up, it was a good one to cover, so that, if you're planning a particular game, that you want it to be like a scary sort of haunted kind of thing, this would be a good resource for that you can pick up. Like I said, I picked it up for $5.99. It was on sale. I'd said it's normally $9.99. I don't know if or when that sale's going to end. But I'll put a link down below of where I picked it up. And again, it's not an affiliate link. I don't make anything off of that, just, trying to help you guys out. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular book, what you thought about it. And if you got it at the time, or if you're inspired to maybe try to check it out. Maybe you've read some of these stories that were mentioned and you want to share your thoughts on those. Or maybe you end up running a Necromancer game, or you've run one in the past. I would love to hear about it. And so leave all of that in the comments below and let me know. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, etc. You'll find links to my blog where I share new content from time to time. It's been a minute, but I will get back to that soon with sharing content. So definitely let me know how the audio was on this, if you appreciated it better. I will tell you that because I'm having to record in segments, because my phone holds a maximum of about 15 minutes of video at a time, 15 to 16. I had to record this in chunks and then download it to my laptop and then start my phone back up. And one of the segments, I forgot to plug my microphone in. So I just don't have it in me to go back and try to re-record that with the microphone. So it might sound a little weird in the middle. And if it's so, that's why. I didn't pick it up when I was listening, but I think some people maybe just have a better sense of hearing than I do. Or if you're listening with headphones and stuff, that might be that might happen. But let me know. Let me know if it was worth it for this audio to use this microphone that I'm using right now. And that is going to wrap up this particular video. So I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, please, happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. All right, and now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to while I made my notes for this video. So I was having some of this. I bought a few of these just to try them. I want to try one with you here on the channel. This is another pumpkin beer. So it's today's September 30th. So we're a little over a week into fall. And I like to drink pumpkin beer during the fall time. I like fall. I told you last time it's my favorite season of the year. And so I like to do different things to kind of, celebrate that it's fall time. So I have never had this beer before. Well, I tasted it last night, and but I'm going to open this one for you guys. So this is Southern Tier Brewing Company Caramel Pumpkin. So they have just a standard one just called Pumpkin that is an imperial pumpkin ale, but this is the caramel one. So I went into this knowing that it was going to be a little bit sweeter, but I kind of wanted to check it out because I'd never had it. So this is from Southern Tier. They're in Lakewood, New York, as you see there. And so, just trying to do a little something to get into the season. It's we're having another excessive heat warning here where I live, which sucks because, it's fall time. I want it to be a little bit cooler. So let's give that a pour. And I meant to use, well, we'll toast really quick. So cheers. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed that. I kind of liked the whole Necromancer theme. It was pretty, I enjoyed that, doing that. Yeah, this is exactly how I remember it tasting yesterday. It's not something I'd get again. I will put it that way. It is very sweet. The sweetness really overpowers the pumpkin flavor. I'm not getting a ton of the pumpkin spices. It's mostly, I'd say, I get a lot of like toffee and yeah, I mean, it's not bad. It's just I prefer the regular pumpkin ale more. You could perhaps cut this, like if you got, I have one of their regular pumpkin ales. It's not a horrible idea to like maybe do like a mix to kind of try to make this not quite so sweet. If you like sweet beers, it's probably going to be right up your alley. It's just not really what I was looking for. But it was fun to try something new. So I also forgot to show you guys this last time. My friend Bill gave this to me for my birthday. So he did the layout for my Alchemy Explosions and Inventions book. And he's helped me with most of my shirt designs that I have for sale at my shop. And he did the full color illustration that is in my Alchemy Explosives and Inventions book. But anyway, he made this for me for my birthday. He has one of those machines that can like cut things out of wood. And so he made this coaster, and on one side it has this. So I've rolled a 1. And on the flip side, he put the symbol of my favorite superhero, which is the Flash. So I thought it was really fun, and I meant to show you guys that last week. But there it is. Okay, so there's the beer. And then as far as the record, so I was super excited to get this. This is a birthday gift from a different friend of mine. It's the dad player in my daughter's D&D game, so he's the only other adult that plays besides me. So he gave this to me for my birthday. So this is Time Out by the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And as you see here, the record store did this on this is just the sleeve, so it's not hurting the actual record. They wrote 6i mono original. And okay, so what does all that mean? Well, this album's 1959. So if you've heard me talk before, you know that there's just a litany of important jazz albums that came out in 1959. It's kind of the year that really defines this era of jazz. And like Kind of Blue came out that year. Giant Steps, The Shape of Jazz to Come, Mingus I think was that year. And this one, a very important record in jazz. So this kind of epitomizes the sort of what they would call cool jazz, West Coast jazz, very different style than what was being played in like Chicago, Kansas City, New York. And but it was super popular. It was a lot of people who didn't think that they liked jazz. This was like their intro record to jazz. And then it was getting a ton of airplay. There is a little bit of sort of that, like, so Dave Brubeck and the majority of his band were white. And so there's a lot of people that kind of feel like, oh, people only started to like this because it was white players and it was being picked up. Back in the day, even the radio stations were segregated. So there were certain radio stations that wouldn't play music by black artists, but they would play this. And so that's why for a lot of people, this was the first jazz that they ever heard. I mean, thank goodness those days are behind us. But that being said, this is still a great album. Like, it's not fair to judge it because of that, because the music is great. And what is unique about this album? So it's called Time Out. And the premise of this album is that Dave Brubeck is experimenting with different time signatures that are not common in jazz. So jazz is usually played in a 4/4, sometimes 3/4 time signature. So this one uses all kinds of weird things. So Take 5, as an example, is in a 5/4 time signature. It also has an extended jazz drum solo, which was not a thing that people did back then. And it was such a departure of the music that the saxophone player Paul Desmond on this, which he also helps, I think, write some of the songs, but he was really upset that the drummer was getting a drum solo because he felt it was taking away from the music. But it was like that was part of that song. But Blue Rondo a la Turk. So the deal with this song is that Dave Brubeck was traveling and he was in Eastern Europe, and I want to say, yeah, I mean, he must have been in Istanbul, so not Eastern Europe so much as like sort of the gateway between East and West. But anyway, he heard some street musicians playing this song, and the rhythm of the song, I want to say it's 9/8 time signature, and it just really struck him. And so then he wrote the song, and so this is a really famous song. But if there's one song you've heard off this album, it's probably this one, Take 5. I can almost guarantee that you've heard that song before, whether it was in an ad or a movie or a TV show, or you heard it wherever, right? On the radio, you stumbled across it. So definitely check this out. It's one of my favorite jazz albums. My dad in the Navy got to see Dave Brubeck perform in San Diego. And so he's always was telling me stories about it. So he really loves this album. He was jealous that I got it. But yeah, it's really cool. Okay, so what is this 6-eye mono? What are we talking about here? Well, okay, so it was recorded in mono originally, which means there's no difference between your right and left speaker. It's the same on both because it was recorded with one mono. That's what that means, right? So a lot of times albums would later on be remastered by somebody into stereo. A lot of Beatles albums were done that way, the early ones, but they originally recorded in mono. And I think that if it was recorded in mono originally, then that's how you should listen to it. And so I prefer to listen to this in mono. I think it kind of sounds better. Okay, so now the 6-eye thing. I put it in a different sleeve, and I'm not putting it in here because, so if you're not into vinyl, you might not know, but a lot of times really old records, if you have the record in the sleeve because you've got it, on your shelf and you've got other records pressing up against it, the vinyl will start to push through into your sleeve. It's called ring wear. And you don't really see it too much on this particular sleeve, which is good, but I want to keep the sleeve nice. You can kind of see a little scuff. I can see it. You might not be able to catch it, but like right around here, there's some scuffing. And yeah, actually right here too. See, right here, that vinyl was starting to push through before. And so that's called ring wear. And it's not something that you want, obviously. And so if you put the record on the back like this, you can keep it nicer. So there was an original paper sleeve in here. These are not good for the records. You can see this one's been eaten by something or got ripped or could have been chewed by bugs or something. But those types of sleeves aren't great for your records. So if you have the original sleeve, you want to keep it, but I put it in a nicer sleeve here. Okay, so the 6-eye thing, it's this design, and it's very highly collectible and desirable from collectors, because Columbia at a certain point, not too long after, it's going to change their labels. And so a lot of times you'll get, a record that's an old record, but you can tell right away that's not original because it doesn't have the 6-eye design. So that's kind of the short version of that. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of it. So that was my record. Check it out. Again, you can find it on your streaming services and just give it a chance. I think it's really fun. And again, it's all instrumental. So it's something that I can easily listen to while I'm taking notes and I don't get distracted. But I'm familiar with it. So I'm also listening to it as well. All right. So cheers. Thanks again for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will talk to you next time.